This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today is Sunday, August 22nd. And in my walk talks on Sundays, I like to focus on some spiritual or theological subject, question to meditate on. And one thought that I've been chewing on recently, remember I work full-time in education, so I spend all of my time thinking about education, paying attention to what the world is doing in education, what Catholics are doing in education. And what's obvious in this generation, what's painfully obvious, is that for most people, education is seen simply as a market. It's a place to get a job. It's a place to sell something. And there's all kind of activity in education where people are trying to make money. And it leads to all kinds of evils. Remember that the scriptures warn us that the love of money is the root of all evil. Evil proceeds from a desire for money. We also have to remember that instructing the ignorant, which is supposedly the work of education, instructing the ignorant is supposed to be a work of mercy. It's a necessary work. And those who are educated, or those who possess knowledge or wisdom, are called upon by God to share that wisdom as an act of mercy, sort of a form of almsgiving. Whereas we might give alms in the forms of money or clothing or food, instruction is another form of almsgiving, because the word almsgiving, all it means is giving mercy, being merciful. The Beatitude says, "Blessed are the merciful." Those who are empathetic, those who are grateful, those who realize that what they have, while they may have invested some effort to get it, they have what they have because they've been fortunate, and someone, somewhere, whether it's God Himself or some other person, either present or having lived in history, we've received from someone else. And anyone who reflects on his life soberly is conscious of how much he possesses that he has received. And the gratitude that a person has for the benefits he's received from others leads him to not consider his possessions as his own. He doesn't say, "By the strength of my own hand, I have obtained this." He doesn't say that. In fact, God warns us against speaking like that. He says, "By the grace of God, I am what I am. By the help of so-and-so, I have what I have. And therefore, my possessions really are only partly mine." And this sense of gratitude leads to a sense of obligation, and that's the disposition that puts us, or that moves us to show mercy to others. For example, a couple of weeks ago at Mass, I was sitting in the pew, and my family is pretty well ordered. I have a beautiful Catholic wife, handsome, healthy children. Our family passes the eye test at church, if you know what I mean. Doesn't mean we're good. It just means that we appear good to anyone looking. But a few rows up, there was a man there who was overweight, barely dressed. He was wearing a pair of shorts and a t-shirt. And I'm not talking about barely dressed in the sense that he was poor. You could just tell a guy with no culture, no real purpose in life, just showing up at church, dressed as if he was watching television. And sitting next to him was a little boy. I don't know if it was his son or not, because they looked nothing alike. But this little boy was a chubby little kid, white kid. The man looked a little Hispanic, but the boy was a chubby little white kid. And he too was dressed as if he was sitting in his living room. But as I looked at that kid, and I guessed that maybe he was 11 or 12 years old, I thought to myself, that was me when I was 11 years old. I was a chubby little white kid with no culture, public school kid, was taken to church once in a while, given no instruction. And it's different to look at a kid and remember where you've come from. And rather than having any kind of critical or judgmental thoughts about people, realizing that that kid could grow up and do wonderful things in his life. And I spent my time that day at Mass praying for that kid. I don't know who he was, and I've seen him a couple times since, but I spent the time at Mass praying for that kid, remembering my own childhood, and asking God to show that boy the same mercy and to give him the same grace that he gave me as I moved from childhood into adulthood. And it's that sense, as I said, that sense of gratitude that moves us to perform the works of mercy. Instructing the ignorant is one of these works of mercy. That's why in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, while I bear the responsibility as a layman of providing for a wife and children, I've always tried to be mindful of the poor, and I've always offered our program at no cost to anyone who needs financial assistance. I've always offered to help people without checking first to see whether they're enrolled or not. If they ask me a question, I give them an answer. If they ask for help, we give it. And the reason why is because I consider education to be a work of mercy at some level. And then, of course, there's another species of education that's not a work of mercy, but is a professional pursuit or a privileged opportunity, and that's treated differently. But education is at its heart a work of mercy. We have no right to deny someone access to information that's important for them or necessary for them. Divine revelation is an example of God's mercy. God reveals to us what we need to know to be saved. He teaches us. He teaches the ignorant. He works in mercy. He charges us nothing for this revelation. That's mercy, and we're to be imitators of God, as St. Paul says. So when we look around, we see all of this activity in education, and so much of it has no grounding in any truth or necessity. It's just purely pursued for the sake of financial gain. And there's an easy way to prove whether a teacher is interested in education itself, truly interested in the benefit of his students, interested in teaching, interested in helping people, or whether he's just interested in money. There's a very easy way to prove a teacher. And it's to simply look at what kind of work he does. A person who's just interested in money is simply looking for ways to make money. He wants to work as little as possible. And everything he does, he seeks a financial reward for, because that's his motive, that's the end that his actions seek. And he's seeking how he can maximize his financial gains while simultaneously minimizing his actual work. Just as any product manufacturer would do who's trying to maximize profits. We'll find that these con men, as it were, are more like salesmen than teachers. They're always talking about their products, or they're talking about education, leading you to some product or service for sale. And what we don't find is them actually teaching. Because the real work of education is the actual teaching of the content. The actual teaching of the lessons. The actual assistance offered to students. That's the real work of teaching. And if you think about it, how many people have you seen actually teaching the lessons, showing that they've mastered the sources, showing that they're able to help students learn the contents of the writings of wise men, of the necessary and important subjects of true learning? You'll rarely find videos by people in education where they're actually teaching the content. In fact, you'll never really know whether they can teach the content, and the content of their teaching will often be hidden You won't know if they can teach until after you've made your non-refundable payment. They don't show any sign of interest in teaching What's seen is an interest in marketing and selling. Selling a product, selling a service. A true teacher is not concerned so much with marketing and selling. He's actually concerned with teaching. He's actually concerned with the sources of learning and their exposition. He's helping students to understand them. He can prove that he's studied them by his ability to introduce students to them, walk students through them, and lead students to a confident mastery of them, a mastery that's demonstrable. Another sign of a real teacher is that he's a zealous student. He would rather be left alone to study because he is passionate and in pursuit of learning. And teaching, for such a person, is the means by which a living can be earned justly, without distracting him from his pursuit of wisdom. A real teacher doesn't want to do anything else. A real teacher, if given a day off, will study. And he teaches so that he can study. And the reason why he's a good teacher is simply because he's taught himself and he's a good student. When a student asks a question, a true teacher can remember wrestling with that issue himself. And he can also explain how he overcame some difficult lesson or some complicated passage. He can explain the key to another student. And that's what makes him a good teacher. He knows how to learn the material because he has himself successfully studied that material. So another test of a good teacher is an obsession with study. You'll often find that good teachers are not social butterflies. They like to be alone. They like to study. They're seeking solitude. They're seeking privacy when they're not engaged with students. They're not interested in speaking at conferences. They're not interested in writing books. They're not interested in being on television or on radio or shows or podcasts. They're interested in studying. They're interested in meditating. They're interested in teaching. They're not looking for friends. They're looking for quiet so they can study. This is a mark of a true teacher. Now, when a man decides that he wants to pursue wisdom, he realizes that there are certain things that distract him from his studies and prevent him from making progress in his learning. And when he realizes these things are in the way, he seeks to get them out of the way. This is another sign of a true teacher. He wants to be free for study, and yet there are things that get in the way of his studies. And I'll give you a few examples, because I am one of these men who, since I was 18 years old, have desired really nothing in my life except the opportunity to continue studying and pursuing wisdom. And I can explain to you the kinds of things that get in the way. The first thing that gets in the way is financial obligations or costs of living. And what's important about the costs of living is that some of these are necessary and natural, and there's no way to escape from them. Man is born into debt. He's in debt to his body for the duration of his life. There's no man who can live for free. He's born with a body that needs to be fed, and he's indebted to that body for his entire life. That's why it's funny when people talk about living debt-free. It's impossible to ever live debt-free as a human being because you're born a debtor to your own body, a debtor to your own physical needs. And so our souls are not free to pursue those things that are of interest only to the soul, truly spiritual things. They also must attend to the needs of the body. And these are simple things like the need for basic nourishment, the need for protection against the weather, and so on. Simple things. Simple things. And so when a man is zealous for wisdom, he sees that his physical needs are an obstacle to undistracted, undisturbed study and meditation. And the right response from such a man is to ask the question, what do I actually need? What do I actually need? And when we learn about the needs of our physical bodies, we find that God has made our bodies very efficient. And while we are in debt to the needs of our flesh, this debt is actually very, very small. In fact, it's very easy to obtain what's necessary for the nourishment of our flesh. And so when a man realizes that, he realizes that he must make provision for the necessities of the flesh, of the body, of his life. He sets that as the limit of his desires, and he lives in what would be considered a state of perpetual fasting. A good example of this can be found in the rule of Saint Benedict. We see, if we read the rule of Saint Benedict, he prescribes 1 meal per day. 1 meal per day. He does allow for the abbot to decide to offer the brothers a second meal, a supper, if there is some manual labor, some tiresome manual labor to be performed, let's say field work in the summertime. He allows for a supper to be added to the daily meal, but the rule of Saint Benedict prescribes 1 daily meal per day. for the brothers. In modern society, if we consider the definition of fasting, this life of one meal per day, as I said, would be considered a life of fasting. It was the norm. In the Summa Theologica, when St. Thomas talks about fasting, he first asks the question, what would be the ideal time of day to eat? Because he, having been raised in the Benedictine community and later becoming a Dominican, he lived this same simple life. And he investigated the question, what would be the best time or the most appropriate time for the daily meal to be taken, and he concluded that it would be at midday, around noon. That's when the body is most fit for eating. And when he talks about fasting, what he talks about is delaying the daily meal from midday to the 9th hour of the day, which is around 3 p.m., let's say mid-afternoon. That extra delay in taking the daily meal was considered fasting. And the discomfort that would be imposed upon the body by making it wait an additional 3 hours for its daily nourishment was that sacrificial work. But it's also worth noting that if a man eats more than is necessary, he cannot fast. Because if he were to deny himself, let's say, a third meal, he would still be eating more than he needs, and he would not be fasting. If he denied himself a second meal, he would still be eating what he needs, and would therefore not be fasting. But more important than fasting, or the practical details of fasting, is the motive for fasting, the end for fasting. And the end that's sought through fasting is freedom. Freedom to pursue something more noble than the pleasures of the palate, as John Cassian discussed or described gluttony. What's more important when we consider fasting is that there's an end of fasting. There's a benefit to be gained through fasting, and the question is whether there's anything that we consider to be more desirable, or as Aristotle used to say, more delectable than the pleasure that we could receive from our food. If the pleasure of food in our hearts is most delectable, we're never going to be able to give it up. Men always like to talk about sacrifice as if the way to some kind of sanctity is by sacrificing things that we desire, things that we love. But that's not true. Holy men don't gain, or I should say, holy men don't practice holiness as an act of sacrifice. This is a misconception, really a false teaching that leaves everyone frustrated and confused. Virtuous men don't sacrifice when they sacrifice. When virtuous men choose to forego some desirable thing, they do so because they desire something else. They don't sacrifice something that they desire. They often don't struggle at all with the disciplines they practice because they practice them to obtain something else. And because sacrificing them or avoiding those things gives them access to what they desire, they actually consider that sacrifice to be easy. It's a delight. They're happy to sacrifice that because it enables them to enjoy what they actually desire. And I'll give you a very clear example from sacred scripture. The greatest act of sacrifice ever was the crucifixion, where Jesus accepted the torture of the crucifix, though it was undeserved. And we look at that, and St. Paul, in the book of Romans, marvels at the sacrifice of the cross. He says, someone might be willing to die for another good man. If you had a friend or relative that you loved who had done you innumerable benefits and was in danger, you might consider dying for that good man. But Christ demonstrates his love in this, that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Christ didn't die for his good friends and benefactors. He didn't die for people who had done good things to him all his life. He didn't die for righteous men, as it were. He died for men who needed him to die for them because of their sins, because they were evil. And we look at that and we marvel and say, as the hymn says, what wondrous love is this? And we look at the cross and we say, I can't do that. I could never do that. I can't love my enemies. I can love my children. I can love my wife. I can love my friends. But if you look around, just look at how Christians talk about non-Christians. They don't love them. They're in competition with them, trying to defeat them, talking bad about them, shunning them, and so on. They don't have this love of Christ that we see in the crucifix, or in the crucifixion, I should say. And yet, if we read more from St. Paul, from the book of Philippians, we find that it's not so sacrificial, at least from Christ's perspective, as it may appear from our perspective. St. Paul in Philippians chapter 2 tells us why Christ accepted the crucifixion. St. Paul says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. Remember when Christ was in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night he was betrayed, he prayed and he said, "Father, let this cup pass from me." It was not Christ's desire to be crucified. He didn't find the crucifixion to be delectable. As far as his humanity was concerned, he was terrified as he prepared for his impending passion. We read of his praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we don't find there in that garden an excited, confident man eager to run to the cross, as many people stupidly talk about today when they talk about how happy they would be to be able to die for the faith. That's stupid talk. That's nonsense talk. When we see Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see what a true martyr looks like. Christ did not want to suffer, but there was something Christ wanted more than for that cup to pass from him. He says, "It is for this reason that I have come to this hour." And he says, "Thy will be done." Christ accepted the suffering of his passion because there was something that he wanted that was greater, that made the sacrifice, or that made the suffering worth it. He wanted to please his Father. He wanted to return to his glory. He wanted to be with his Father. He wanted to please his Father. Pleasing his Father was the joy of his soul. And that's why St. Paul can say, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross." And when we consider in our lives any quote-unquote sacrifice that's to be made, it's not to be made for its own sake. And we can tell when we make a sacrifice for its own sake. There's a very easy way to tell when we make a sacrifice for its own sake or when someone else does so. And the way that we can tell is that we talk about it. We talk about it. We talk about the fact that we're fasting. We talk about the donation that we made. We talk about praying. You see people all over social media talking about praying, which is the opposite of what Christ told us to do. He said, when you pray, go into your room or closet, some translate it, close the door and pray to your Father who sees what is done in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. But that reward is not what motivates a man to pray who talks about his prayers. What motivates a man who prays truly is that thought of receiving God's reward for his secret prayers. And anyone who worships God in spirit and in truth like Jesus speaks of in John chapter 4, hearing Jesus' teaching on that reward promised to those who pray in secret, they will be zealous for that spiritual reward, that grace. They will not be talking about their prayers. In fact, you might not even know that they pray, because it's none of your business that they pray. And Jesus says another thing about such people who don't do things for the right reasons. He says, they pray that they may be seen by men. And he says, and they have their reward. In other words, they get the attention from men that they want, the reward from men, which motivates their hypocritical or acted prayers. They're acting. That's what the word hypocrite means, an actor. Acting like they're praying to be seen by men so that those men will give them some reward, which is the motive of their fake prayers. But true prayer is made to God in private. And what's desired is the reward that God promises to those who pray in secret. So we can say, oh, I can't believe I heard that this one saint used to sacrifice and he used to pray for 4 hours. He wasn't sacrificing. That saint was not sacrificing. To you, that appears to be a sacrifice, as if he made some resolution to not do what he wanted to do and to do something else instead. But to that saint, that's not what he was doing. That saint was doing what he wanted to do. Because anything that he could have done other than pray wouldn't have earned for him the reward that Christ promised to those who pray in secret. And that reward was more delectable to him than any other activity or any other end pursued in any other activity. And this is true in fasting as well. We don't fast for the sake of fasting. We don't fast to earn our salvation. We don't fast to simply discipline ourselves as if it's some kind of exercise. We don't fast to save money. We certainly don't fast to talk about it with others. We fast so that we can do something better instead of eating. We pass on food because there's a lot more involved in eating than we usually think about. Especially in a fast food generation where you can pull off the highway, run through a drive-through, and have 1,500 calories worth of food in a bag in 5 minutes. A bag that you can just throw away and hop back on the highway with. Eating in this generation is very deceiving because we've made it easy to eat more. Whereas in a normal situation, in a natural situation, eating is very difficult. If you wanted, for example, some meat in a natural, let's say agricultural society, an animal would have to be killed. People didn't just go open a freezer and grab a hamburger and throw it on the grill. Preparing food required planning, work, preparation. It was difficult to eat. And even after all of the preparation was made, there would be cleaning necessary and all kinds of additional work. And so historically, eating was even more undesirable because of the work that was involved in eating. People didn't eat casually like our generation can. You couldn't just be driving down the highway, as I said, and say, hey, you know what, I would like a bacon cheeseburger right now. Pull off the road, grab a bacon cheeseburger. No one could ever do that. And so this question of eating becomes even more confusing today, because it doesn't actually take much effort to eat as it would have in the past. Or in the past, there might have been a big feast, and you could have glutted yourself at a feast on a special occasion. And that might be different. But the everyday gluttony of modern society wasn't even possible. There's a proverb that warns about avoiding the company of gluttonous eaters of meat. But today, you can be a glutton without skipping a beat for just a couple bucks. Very, very deceiving. And yet there's a bigger question to be asked. Not, should you be eating this or that? So many people talk about nutrition, and what they're really talking about is whether or not they might be healthier if they ate differently, rather than questioning eating itself, and whether just the constant eating is the real problem, because it's totally unnatural to just sit around eating all the time. Multiple meals per day with no work required, no preparation, eating and eating and eating, wasn't even possible in most of world history, isn't possible in most places in the world today. And so people imagine that they're unhealthy or overweight simply because they don't eat the right things 4 times a day, rather than questioning the whole practice itself. What we should be asking is whether there's something better to do with our time and energy, better to do than eating. And there certainly is. There certainly is something better to do than eating. This is my answer to people who talk about struggling with pornography. I just say, don't you have anything better to do? Don't you have anything better to do? For example, in my own life, I've talked about this many times. I was dedicated to sports as a kid. All through my childhood and high school, I played sports year-round, and when I wasn't playing sports, I was practicing sports, and when I wasn't practicing sports, I was watching sports. It was just sports, sports, sports. And when I became a Christian, my love of sports, I started to realize, was getting in the way of something that I was beginning to love more, which was studying. I couldn't devote all of the time that was necessary to study because of my interest in sports. There would be a college football game on television or something else, and I would be distracted from my studies by this interest that I had in sports. But as time went on and my love of learning grew more and more fervent, I found myself not even interested in sports anymore. To this day, I can't be interested in sports. It's just not as interesting to me as my studies and my work. What I desired was not overcome by some kind of conscious, planned resolution. It was simply replaced by a love for something else, something better, something more noble, more profitable, more satisfying, more virtuous. And so when we struggle with these vices and these bad habits, whether it's overeating, whether it's just wasting time watching television or watching movies or surfing the internet, watching sports, we shouldn't think to ourselves, how can I sacrifice this? What we should ask ourselves is, why do I not have something better in my life than this? I'm a Christian. Think of the things I have available to me. Why is my life not devoted to prayer or to study or to evangelization or to missionary work? Why is my desire in life to watch people have sex, or to watch people play sports, or to simply watch people act or sing? The real question is not, why do Christians do these things? The real question is, why aren't Christians doing better things? Why aren't Christians doing better things? And this is where simplicity of life, things like voluntary poverty, chastity, obedience, fasting, almsgiving, all of these other works of the Christian life, this is where they come in. They don't come in as some kind of dark, sad, painful, unpleasant sacrifices that have to be made. And if we do them with that spirit, it only shows that we don't understand what we're doing. It shows that something is wrong. The crucifixion was pursued by our Lord for joy. For joy. Living in this world was not as delectable for Christ as pleasing his Father and receiving the reward for his obedience. And St. Paul goes on to tell us that because of his obedience, because he endured the cross, God gave to him the name above every other name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is the Lord. That's why Christ suffered voluntarily. He thought of the reward, the honor of being crowned Lord of all, King of kings. And for that joy set before him, he endured the cross. He wasn't thinking about how he needs to make this sacrifice, how it's good to sacrifice, how he should just offer up his sacrifices, how he should just do what God commands, carry this burden. That's not the spirit with which he overcame the world. He overcame the world by fixing his eyes and meditating on something better, something that was better than anything that he would lose, something that was better than the taste of the hamburger, something that was better than the pleasure of whatever carnal activity might have been had instead. He wasn't sacrificing those pleasures, he was seeking a greater and more perfectly satisfying pleasure. It was for joy that he endured the cross. And this brings us back to the topic of this talk, which is true learning and true teaching. We'll find that a true teacher practices many of the penitential works and lives with the simplicity of life, not because it's some kind of contrived, planned, talked about goal of his life. We'll find that a true teacher lives a life that's characterized by all of those disciplines without even thinking about them. He doesn't think about them. He doesn't talk about them, because what he does think about and talk about are the good things that he desires instead of those things. He doesn't want to have to worry about money, and therefore he's happy to give it away. He doesn't want to be bothered with accounting. He doesn't want to bill all of his customers and spend all of his time chasing people down for the money that they owe him. He doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to try to persuade people to sign up for his lessons or courses. He doesn't want to deal with that work because he wants to study. He wants to meditate. He doesn't want to do these other things that people are zealous for who want money. And this is always considered to be a fault. If we look back through history, we find that men we consider to be geniuses are always ridiculed for being irresponsible. And yet we don't ask why they appear to be irresponsible. And when we consider men who are, quote unquote, responsible, we don't consider that all of the efforts that they made to be responsible prevented them from doing any significant work in their lives. While Mozart was composing famous works of music, his finances were always a mess. We learn of different artists and authors that while they were composing their most famous works, while they were producing their most famous paintings and sculptures, they were in great debt. They were suffering all kinds of trouble. That's the price of their passion for their arts. They knew that at some point they had to choose one or the other, and they chose what they considered to be more desirable. And no one faults them for it now in hindsight. But if you were living with a Mozart or with a Michelangelo, or with many of these modern businessmen who push themselves to the brink of financial collapse, like Elon Musk, I encourage you to watch a video about his life and how many times he's been pushed to the brink of total financial collapse, where he's mocked and criticized by everyone around him, all the quote-unquote responsible people who pull out of the deals to save themselves. And watch how a man like Elon Musk, driven by such passion for his life's goals, considers all of the stress and trouble to be worth it. I'm not saying that we should pursue the things that Elon Musk pursues, but his example of perseverance through difficulties is very, very inspiring. And that same spirit was the spirit that was in most of history's famous men. Because at some point we have to choose what we're going to do well and what we're going to do badly. The people around us are going to criticize us for the things that we choose to do badly, because they're going to choose to do those things well, and they're going to see us suffer what from their perspective appear to be losses. And they have no appreciation for the things that we consider to be gains. They see us as losing and losing, even when we feel like we're getting closer and closer. We see ourselves as approaching our joy or fulfilling our joy, and they see us as spiraling into ruin. And that's how the geniuses and the masters of history have always been perceived by their peers. Everyone praises them in hindsight. Everyone admires their work. Everyone talks about their great dedication. But if we look around at our peers, we'll find that those same people who praise the Mozarts and Beethovens and Michelangelos and other masters of history, they are the enemies to the masters around them in their own lives. They are the critics and the scoffers. They don't understand that the losses of these great men are not perceived to be losses. They're like chains that are broken away from. And they're content to lose all of these things for the joy set before them. A true teacher has wisdom as that joy set before him. He is a philosopher, a lover of wisdom. He is not a lover of money. He is a lover of wisdom. And this is why if we read in the book of Proverbs, when Proverbs speaks of wisdom, he speaks of wisdom as an end and always compares wisdom to gold and silver and pleasures of this life, and says there is nothing that compares to her. The wise man considers wisdom to be the thing for which he will trade everything that he has. Jesus talks about the pearl of great price, and a man learned of this pearl of great price and sold everything that he had to buy that field, to obtain that pearl. A wise man doesn't sacrifice things. A wise man trades things. He trades inferior things for greater things. These inferior things include bodily pleasures. He trades them for wisdom. These inferior things include money, wealth. He trades them for wisdom. These inferior things include praise from other men, honor from his peers. He trades them for wisdom. And this is the kind of man that needs to be teaching Catholic children. A man who isn't concerned about your money, isn't trying to sell you things all the time. A man whose life's passion is wisdom. That's the kind of man that your children need to spend their time with, time talking to, time chatting with, time listening to. Because the Proverbs teach us, he who walks with wise men becomes wise. He who walks with wise men becomes wise. When you talk to a wise man, you'll find that he talks about all of the other wise men from history as if they're his friends and companions. It sounds as if he lives with these men, or that he's studied with these men, that they were classmates or teachers of his, though they were separated by hundreds or thousands of years. In his life, he lives in a kind of solitude so that he can walk with the wise men instead of his peers. He trades the companionship of his peers for the fellowship of the wise. And what Proverbs says is that a man who walks with wise men will become wise. And that's describing the life of a student. And so we should ask, if we're looking at our children, we should ask, who are our children walking with? Are they walking with wise men? The kind of men whom I've described? Are they walking with wise men? Or are they walking with hirelings and pretenders? If you were to ask a teacher to take a pay cut, would that person still be interested in being a teacher? Or are they teaching only for money? Does a teacher have to follow a teacher's manual written by the publisher because she has no personal interest in the studies and simply needs to know what she needs to do to earn her paycheck? Is she following a teacher's manual? Or is she or he the actual teacher. A person who is actually a teacher won't have a teacher's manual because he won't need one. Our students need to be with real teachers. They need to be taught by real teachers. They need to feel the zeal and passion of real teachers. They need teachers whom they can ask any question, and they will never catch the teacher off guard or unprepared because the teacher has already asked himself that question and sought out the answer. These are the kind of teachers our kids need. And as I said, these true teachers will be marked by the simplicity of life and the focus of the wise man. They won't be interested in talking about sports or food or home decoration. They won't want to talk about this or that kind of beer or wine. They won't talk about cars. They won't be interested in vulgar subjects. They're not interested in pleasures and pastimes. They're zeroed in on their end, which is wisdom. That's the thing that they love because they're philosophers, lovers of wisdom. And the true philosophers are marked by their virtuous, simple, Christ-like lives. They're not salesmen. They're not trying to be celebrities. They're not trying to get on television. They're not trying to be on the radio or guests on podcasts. They're not trying to publish books with their names on them for sale so they can boast about where they are in the rankings on Amazon. If you were to meet a wise man and ask him, "What are you? Tell me about yourself," consider the fact that when St. Paul introduced himself, he introduced himself as a servant of Jesus Christ. That's how he identified himself. How many men do you know identify themselves in that way? A servant of Christ, a lover of wisdom, a student of philosophy, a teacher of the classical liberal arts, a teacher of theology, a student of divine revelation. That's how true teachers think of themselves. And if you desire to be a true teacher, it's not about sacrificing things. It's not about giving up things you love and desire. If you love and desire other things, you're not a teacher. You're not even a student. The word student means one who is seeking. If you look up the word studium in Latin, you'll see that one of the definitions is zeal. What marks a student is passion, focus, pursuit. If you still desire other things, you simply don't love wisdom yet. And if you don't love wisdom, if you don't consider her to be more precious than any other thing in the world, you're not going to reach her because she requires everything of you. The truth is complex. Wisdom requires a very long and difficult ascent. It's the ultimate calling of a human life, where a man actually accomplishes the perfection of his nature to become wise. It takes everything you have, and therefore, if you don't desire it exclusively, you'll never have it. And when you look back into history and see the prophets and wise men, the scribes, the apostles, the doctors of the church and saints, what they all have in common is this laser-like focus. And they desired nothing else. They didn't sacrifice everything every day. They didn't wake up making lists of what they were going to sacrifice today. They simply pursued what they loved and ignored everything else. So if you want to be a teacher, you first need to become a student, not by enrolling in a school and paying tuition, but by setting wisdom as the only pursuit of your life. The only thing you think about, the only thing you talk about. It was said of St. Dominic that he either spoke to God or about God, that he spoke of nothing else. He was either speaking to God or he was speaking about God. And that was it. That was St. Dominic. He had one desire. And if you asked him, he probably wouldn't even be aware of sacrifices he was making day by day because he wasn't thinking about those things. And until you have within yourself the desire for wisdom, you'll simply never make progress. You'll never make progress. You'll stay with the crowds, talking about all the same stuff. You'll be reading G.K. Chesterton. You'll be watching Archbishop Fulton Sheen videos. You'll be reading Scott Hahn books. You'll be watching the news and talking about the headlines. You won't be talking about the stuff that wise men talk about. You won't be reading the sources that wise men read. Think about this. If you read the Summa Theologica, and St. Thomas refers to the sources that he reads, are those the sources that you refer to when you talk about what you read? If not, you're not like St. Thomas. St. Thomas talks about Aristotle and Plato. He talks about St. Augustine. He talks about St. Jerome, John Chrysostom, Dionysius. These are the sources in his mind as he thinks and argues and teaches. What are your sources? Are they the sources of common people who are just buying books and watching YouTube videos? Or are the sources of your thoughts the sources that were of the thoughts of wise men of the past? If you read something written by St. Alphonsus Liguori or St. Augustine or St. Francis de Sales, what are the sources that they cite to support their arguments? Are they common books? They're all the same sources. Sacred Scripture, the Church Fathers, the ancient philosophers. Those are the authors studied and spoken of by wise men. If you want to stay in the popular book list, if you want to pass around the quotes on social media, and it's always the same handful of shallow, common sources. Respectable, for sure. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with G.K. Chesterton or C.S. Lewis or Tolkien or even Archbishop Sheen. But remember, Archbishop Sheen was on television. He wasn't a philosopher living in solitude or teaching in an academy. His teaching was for a television audience. When are you going to cease being a member of the television audience? G.K. Chesterton wasn't writing for philosophers. G.K. Chesterton was writing for the public. When are you going to cease being just one member of the public, reading materials printed for the common people, and ascend to the sources who wrote for the wise men and true students in pursuit of wisdom? You're not going to make that ascent until wisdom becomes your true and only desire in this life. And when you possess wisdom, you're going to possess everything. And that's why pursuing anything else is so unreasonable. Because in pursuing wisdom, you possess everything. Without wisdom, no matter how much you may acquire in this life, you'll possess nothing. So when we consider this life, it should be marked by fasting. It should be marked by voluntary poverty and simplicity. It should be marked by a disinterest in the bread and circuses around us. It should be a life of solitude, a life that's focused, that's private, that's separate, and yet a life that's not alone, that's not selfish, that's not weird or dishonorable. And finding that true life is only possible when wisdom is your actual desire. There's a saying among the ancient philosophers that a wise man or a philosopher always has $1. And what that means is that a man who seeks and pursues and obtains true wisdom is always able to earn what he needs. There's never a need to worry about not having enough for one's own life or even for one's family. A philosopher always can find $1. After all, he's wise, right? He should be able to turn the faucet on, like Jeff Bezos says, and find $1 when he needs one, because he's a wise man. Money making should not be something beyond the reach of the wise man. It's simply something that he doesn't pursue unless he has to, and to the degree that he has to. And so there's nothing to fear in this choice. And again, this sense of fear is owed to a lack of love for wisdom, which, if you loved, would cast out all fear. So I hope that's a motivating meditation on how the sacrificial nature of the Christian life relates to this pursuit of wisdom. Why so many talk about these pursuits, these penitential works and things like that, without understanding at all the spirit of them. And it's why they never practice them, and why they always talk about struggling with their sins. The reason why they're always struggling with their sins is because they're trying to live with things that are incompatible with the Christian life. It's like living with a terrible wife who just argues with everything you say. It's time to stop struggling with sins and set our affections and desires on things that are more noble, more honorable, more satisfying. And if we do that, the simplicity and disciplined nature that we see used to describe the Christian life will suddenly be upon us. We'll be clothed with those virtues because we're focused on something else, something better. And those other benefits will come to us indirectly, without actively seeking them. God bless.